Well, Alex Salmond is here. This poll, which you're aware of, obviously it's just one poll, usual health warnings, but it is a trend now. You must be pretty hopeful you're going to win this.
Yeah, well, obviously we're hopeful, and indeed we're more than hopeful. But it's 2 weeks till the election, Gordon, and this election most certainly isn't won yet, and it'll be won in terms of the work we do over the next 2 weeks and the appeal we make to the people of Scotland, who will decide.
And you have said, and I don't quite understand the argument, you've said if you win the election in the sense that you get the most votes and get to form a government, you think that somehow or other that gives you more of a mandate for a referendum on independence than you had before. Is that right?
Well, not just a referendum on independence. I think in that interview I was putting forward the idea that arithmetic is obviously important in politics, and parliamentary politics in particular, but sometimes things depend a bit more than on arithmetic. I mean, if it had just been a matter of arithmetic, perhaps we wouldn't have got anything like the amount of legislation we got through the Parliament, or achieved nearly as much. Sometimes a bit of momentum, a bit of moral authority, a bit of democratic authority is important as well. And I was merely saying that some of the things that the other parties united to turn down, not just the independence referendum, but minimum pricing and alcohol, I think even if we were in a minority government, would stand a better chance of success second time round.
But why should the opposition parties who were hostile to that idea change their mind when a majority of people in Scotland will not have voted for a referendum on independence?
Well, I think you often find that parties change their mind because the public concentrates on it. I mean, why, for example, the Labour Party changed their mind in a range of policies in the run-up to this election? They've changed their mind because they were frightened of the electorate, frightened of the people. For that reason, I think political parties often adjust their position because they don't want to be in the opposite side to the electorate. I think that would prevail in some issues if we brought them back to the Parliament, having been re-elected by the Scottish people.
And when would you like to hold this referendum?
In the 5-year term.
When?
No, I'll tell you when in the 5-year term. Say, I reckon I made a bit of a mistake last time when I said the year in which we intended to introduce the legislation, and therefore kind of eliminated the flexibility. I think you should look for the political circumstances being right, and let's allow it in the 5-year term. Right,
but from what you're saying, I mean, it would be your number one priority.
No, we'll hold it in the 5-year term. And there's another reason for that in constitutional terms, Gordon. We've got a Scotland bill going through the Westminster Parliament at the present moment, which has to come back to the Scottish Parliament. Now, I'm pretty well convinced if we win the election, as we're fighting to do, then we'll be able to make substantial changes to the economic powers in that legislation. So that would have a very strong priority in the early months of the Parliament. But make no mistake, we intend to bring the referendum bill to the Scottish Parliament within the 5-year term.
So the bottom line here is, if these polls are anything like correct, and you get the number of seats they're suggesting, actually political life in Scotland will be dominated by breaking up Britain.
No, political life in Scotland, well, I perhaps haven't given you the answers you wanted to your initial questions, but can I just restate them? Political life, in terms of the Constitution, will be immediately facing the prospect of enhancing the Parliament's powers so that we can better combat the recession which Westminster politics and Westminster economic policies have dragged us into. That, I think, will be a very immediate priority. But at some point in the 5-year term, we'll introduce the constitutional bill to allow the Scottish people the right to decide in a referendum their constitutional future.
Right. But in other words, it will be dominated by the whole debate about independence.
Well, the debate on the Constitution of Scotland has been with us for the last 40 years. I expect it will be with us until the matter is resolved in a referendum.
But if people don't want a referendum on independence, or don't want political debate in Scotland to be dominated by the whole question of breaking up Britain, they'd be best not to vote SNP this time.
Well, I've seen a variety of views and a variety of polls about whether people want independence, but every single test of opinion on this issue has indicated that people in Scotland want the right to decide their own future in an independence referendum. Every single poll has indicated a substantial majority of people, whether they believe in independence or not, want the right to decide. And why shouldn't they have the right to decide?
Do you think you can... I mean, your whole political life has been dedicated to getting independence for Scotland. I mean, I remember, we've joked about this before, you had, what was it, Free in 2003, and I remember we tried to think up a one for two. I think you came up with Heaven in 2007.
Well, I thought that was one of my better ones, actually.
Well, but you know, are you starting to think, look, I could actually pull this off?
Well, right now I'm kind of focused on the next 2 weeks, and rather than, I mean, obviously we have a manifesto, we have plans, we have ambitions for the future of Scotland. Of course we have, but right now I'm in an election campaign, and I do like. Well,
as I say, your whole political life. Surely you must be thinking.
Can you excuse me?
Maybe I could get this through.
Listen, I've thought that for the last 25 years, but maybe you'd allow me not to count my chickens before they're hatched.
Right. Now, quite apart from the issue of independence, there are quite a lot of people in Scotland in this election do not like what the coalition government in London is up to.
Yeah, well, I'm one of them. Yeah.
And they don't like the cuts.
Mm-hmm.
Now, presumably, you would agree that if in this election your main priority is to send a very loud and clear message to the government in London that they are not approved of, you should vote Labour.
No, I think people should vote SNP, and I think for the overwhelming reason that this election centrally is about who's going to govern Scotland after 2 weeks' time. And
well, it's up to the electorate to decide what it's centrally about.
Well, of course, but I think people are going to judge the parties on their record, on the team that they offer, on the vision they have for the future of the country. This election, incidentally, I believe that the reason, let's put it no further than that the SNP are gaining ground and Labour are losing ground in this election. I think the central reason for that is that our focus in this election is who's best to govern Scotland. Labour's focus in the election seems to be, a footstool for Ed Miliband to govern Britain in 4 years' time. And as people concentrate on the Scottish election,
hang on,
then we're going to win, and they're going to lose ground.
Hang on, it's perfectly legitimate for people to feel, look, if people vote Labour in Wales, people vote Labour in the local elections in England, and people vote Labour in Scotland, this is going to send a very powerful message to David Cameron and Nick Clegg about what their government in London is doing. And frankly, voting SNP is neither here nor there.
I think voting SNP will have a substantial chance of getting immediate changes to the legislation going through Westminster, which will enable us to better defend Scotland. For example, borrowing powers for the Scottish Parliament, which will enable us to run the economy better. If we were merely sending messages to Westminster, then the message from Scotland would be loud and clear. I mean, I think the Royal College of Nursing are a better pressure group for change than the Labour Party.
Well, so what are you saying to people on the doorsteps? I mean, a lot of people must say, look, frankly, a lot of things that affect me and my family, they're things that, I don't know, inflation, the general state of the economy, cuts in benefits, changes to the way that you go about looking for a job. A lot of stuff that's got nothing to do with the Scottish Government. I want to send a message to those Tories in London. Now, what do you and your activists say to people on the doorstep? You say, look, it's not that I don't like you, Alex Salmond, and it's not that I don't think your government hasn't done a due job, it's just that you're not very relevant at the moment.
Well, what we're saying seems to be working, if you allow me to say so, Gordon, because all the evidence we have in this campaign so far is that the SNP case is gaining ground and the Labour case is losing it. And what is our case? We've got the record, the team and the vision to run Scotland. We're not just sending messages, we're delivering good government in Scotland.
If I am, imagine I'm someone on the doorstep, what do you say to me? And I say, look, I'm going to vote Labour. I like you, I like what you've done, but I'm going to vote Labour because I really want to send a message. What do you say to people on the doorsteps?
We say this election is about who's going to govern Scotland. I mean, people send messages in politics and by-elections and in all sorts of ways. This is about who's going to govern Scotland. Certainly, of course.
But that isn't necessarily the most important thing to people.
Yeah, well, it seems to be a very substantial part of this election about choosing a government to run Scotland, choosing the best team to run this country. We'll deliver strong messages to Westminster, but also we'll actually run this country competently and well. And there seems to be a fairly substantial amount of approval as to the SNP's track record in doing exactly that.
Of course, there is one way they could be doing both things simultaneously, I suppose, which would be if you had a grand coalition against the cuts. Is that something you would ever countenance?
Well, the only thing I've ruled out in terms of coalition politics is a coalition with the Conservative Party, because we have diametrically opposite constitutional aims. But I have to say, I don't think an SNP-Labour coalition is uppermost in the likeliest outcomes of post-election negotiations.
But you wouldn't rule it out?
I've already said I've only ruled out one thing, and I've specified what it was. But
would you rule it out if you were the second largest party and they were the largest, and you would have to be deputy first minister?
Well, I'm fascinated by this trend of thought, Gordon, but I just don't think it's a kind of likely outcome. I mean, obviously we're bidding to win this election. I'd like us to become the majority party, and as we've discussed in this programme before, If that's not possible in a PR system, then I think minority government has proven itself over the last 4 years and would prove itself over the next 5 years if it's an SNP government.
Can I just be clear on something? Just what you consider would give you the right to try to form the next government? Presumably it would be having the most MSPs, would it? I mean, is it?
I would say that's correct, yeah.
So you can't conceive of any circumstances where Labour might have a couple more MSPs than you, but you might be having nice negotiations with your best friend Annabel Goldie, and maybe the Liberal Democrats want to come in. You can't conceive of trying to stop Labour forming a government where they had more MSPs than you.
I think in the system we have, having most seats is the crucial thing, and we're entirely geared in our campaign to bring about that outcome. The outcome I conceive is that the SNP winning the election. It's entirely up to the people, but if it's a majority, fine. If it's a minority government, then I think we can handle that and perform a good job. If I may say so, a minority of more than one, a plurality of more than one, if everybody allowed it, would be somewhat more satisfactory than the present situation.
Right, now the Liberal Democrats seem to be somewhat softening, perhaps. I don't want to ascribe to them views they don't have, but perhaps ambiguous now on whether, because of course last time they wouldn't form a coalition with you because you wanted a referendum on independence. If their line softened on that, I mean, I'm just curious actually, have you had any talks with them about this?
No, I read that the line was softening. In fact, the line seemed to be softening as the vote's softening, which is perhaps a coincidence. But I did read that in the papers. Yeah.
Now, if they were to say, OK, we'll have a referendum, and you could form a coalition with them, would you like to do that? Or would, I mean, previously you've said you would actually prefer to have a minority government, but of course if you had a coalition with, say, the Liberal Democrats, you could get more, presumably more of your legislation.
I mean, on this very programme, we established previously that I'd like to win the election overall. It's a PR system. My second preference would be a minority government. Why? Because although it can make life awkward, and occasionally you don't get your legislation through, there is a very clear line of decision-making, which, I mean, some of the great successes of this SNP government has been because of our rapid decision-making, and you tend to lose that a bit in a coalition. So you gain on being able to get legislation through in some cases, but you certainly lose on rapid decision-making. And if we remember the Labour-Liberal coalitions, they weren't without their internal difficulties over that period. Just
to be clear, so you're saying on balance, you would actually rather have a minority government than a coalition with the Liberal Democrats that, for example, might let you get a local income tax?
Well, the minority government was my second preference, but I'm ruling nothing out except we will not have a coalition with the Conservative Party.
Right. Now, you've had great fun arguing that Labour, in fact, you've mentioned already tonight, have changed their positions on a number of issues ahead of this election, and you've made the point that given that your policy platforms are, in your eyes, much the same, it comes down to a choice about which team you want to lead the country. What's wrong with their team?
Well, as for the electorate to decide, I mean, I think a team including Nicola Sturgeon, John Swinney, Kenny McCaskill, Richard Lochhead, Michael Russell is a better team to put on the park than what the Labour Party are able to offer. But
you're not suggesting that Ian Gray is in some way incompetent to be First Minister?
I'm not suggesting anything about my political opponents. I'm concentrating on putting forward the best team to run Scotland. I mean, one of the other advantages in our campaign, if I may say so, and I'm not claiming, endless virtue. I'm just saying that the SNP campaign, if you look at our manifesto launch, for example, is tended to accent the positive, talking about what we can do for Scotland as opposed to what other people can't do.
Right. Because, of course, a lot of the Labour people have run Scotland before. Skye didn't fall in.
No, but the people chose an SNP government for a change for the better.
Right. Now, what about your team? I mean, vote Alex Salmond for First Minister. Can you vote Alex Salmond for anything other than First Minister?
Well, I think it's really important in an election with two ballot papers to define, because everybody knows what a constituency election is. The list election is the one which decides who becomes First Minister.
No, I'm not denying, I'm not questioning your name being on the ballot paper. What I'm saying is, would you be prepared to stay on if you didn't get, I mean, let's say you don't form the next government.
All right, okay.
Right? Will you stay on, or are you going to walk away from all this?
I'll tell you this, hypothetical questions, I hypothesise on success. I'm intent on winning the election. If the Scottish people allow us to do so, we'll serve I'm really not contemplating defeat.
But you can't say to people who think, I love that Alex Salmond, I'm going to vote for him, and maybe he won't win, but at least he'll be there fighting Labour if they're in. No, you can't guarantee to them that you will be there fighting Labour.
No, what I can guarantee is I'm trying my best to win the election, and I'll hypothesise on success.
Right. Now, I'm sure you wouldn't have wished it this way, but the fact is many people, both here and abroad, will view the defining event of the first SNP government as the freeing of Abdel Basit al-Megrahi. Now, I know what all the arguments are about it. I'm just curious about you as a person. I mean, you were First Minister. I mean, do you ever lie awake at night and think, morally, I've got qualms about that?
No, I don't think that at all. Obviously, it was a tough decision, one that Kenny McCaskill had to make. He made his decision. You take your pick and you live with these things. I think he made the right decision. I'm not denying it's a hugely difficult and controversial decision, but all I've asked anybody to do under these circumstances, whether they agreed or disagreed with it, whether people agreed or disagreed with it, is to accept that it was done on good motivation with bona fides, applying the principles of Scots law.
I'm asking you about you. As a person, do you think, hang on a minute, that was in my watch, and I'm just not sure?
No, I think Kenny made the right decision.
Right. Council tax freeze, which you've promised.
And delivered.
Well, no, you're promising for 5 years.
Yeah, we delivered for 4 years. Yeah.
All right, OK. What if councils don't go along with it? Would you consider legislation to force them to?
Well, I think all the evidence is that the mechanism... I mean, we had this argument in the last election, and then we had the argument after the election where lots of people, commentators, people like yourself, newspapers, other parties said, this won't possibly happen, it won't possibly work. But it has worked, and John Swinney found the mechanism that central government could compensate local government for the council tax freeze, and lo and behold, all 32 councils in Scotland over the last 4 years have implemented the council tax freeze. Now, I think on the same basis, they will implement the freeze over the next 5 years if the SNP, and only if the SNP, are elected.
Right. So you wouldn't consider legislating on this?
I don't think it will be necessary, Gordon. I'm quite certain that the councils... well, I'm not ruling anything out, but I don't consider it necessary because I believe that the mechanism that John found... I mean, it would be irrational for any council, in my opinion, not to take the compensation that central government pays for the council tax freeze in return for freezing the council tax.
While all these rich people living in big houses don't have to pay extra council tax, how long under your financial plans will it be before public sector workers can expect a pay rise? Well,
let me take the first part of your question. The council tax is a deeply regressive tax. If you lower that tax by freezing it, it's a progressive move. And the evidence says the lowest income decile gains most in terms of a portion of income from freezing the council tax. And the arrangement with our unions is a 2-year freeze in the council tax.
I'm saying, what is your plan? Is it going to be more than 2 years? Is it going to be 3 years?
We negotiate with our public sector unions.
But you must have built it into your financial calculations.
Well, we will negotiate with our public sector unions when the time comes, but we envisage a 2-year freeze in pay. They've agreed to that.
Initially, sorry, you're saying you only envisage a 2-year freeze?
We envisage a 2-year freeze in pay, and then we'll negotiate again with our workforce as opposed to on Newsnight. And incidentally, the no compulsory redundancy agreement was one of the things that allowed that to be acceptable.
All right, Alex, I'm going to have to leave there. Thank you very much indeed. Very quick look at tomorrow's front pages. Where are they? There they are. The Times, that poll, Salmond heads for victory in poll shock. It says Nationalists 10-point lead unassailable. Scottish Sun, Cardinal on bomb alert, Catholic leader and Stars Celts fans warned, as we were talking about that earlier. And the Herald bomber is Scotland's most dangerous man, it says. That's all.